All right, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar to learn more about ERA's participation in Act 3, a $50 million global funding call to accelerate CCUS technology. My name is Mark Summers. I'm the Executive Director of Technology and Innovation for Emissions Reduction Alberta, or ERA.
And I'm Steve MacDonald, the CEO for ERA. Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us.
Steve and I will be passing the microphone back and forth today as we talk about our new partnership with the Accelerating CCS Technologies initiative and the latest call for proposals, Act 3. We'll also both be here after the presentation to answer questions during the live Q&A period. Before we get into the agenda, I'd like to start by going through a couple housekeeping items just to make sure we get the most out of our time today. First off, we are expecting a number of participants today, so everyone's microphone is muted just to avoid unintentional background noise. If you encounter technical challenges related to the webinar connection, please feel free to email Amanda at info@eralberta.ca and we will try to help where we can. However, if you can't resolve your technical issues or if you need to leave early, we will be posting a recording of this webinar. You'll find it in the funding section of our website. The recording will include both the presentation and the live Q&A, both with audio. In terms of an agenda for today's webinar, we plan to cover a few items that will hopefully be informative for everyone on the line. First, Steve will talk briefly about ERA and our mandate as an organization. Next, we'll provide an overview of the Act 3 call and ERA's participation in Act 3 that was announced on September 22nd by the Minister of Alberta Environment and Parks, Jason Nixon. We'll cover some key points regarding scope and eligibility for the call, the submission process, and the timelines around a final funding decision. We'll provide some advice for anyone that's interested in making a submission, and finally, we'll end off by answering some questions from the audience here today. So if you have any questions you would like us to address, please feel free to type them into the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel. We'll answer as many questions as we can, but if we don't address your specific question, you're most welcome to follow up with us afterward. So with that, it is my pleasure to turn things over to our CEO, Steve MacDonald.
Thank you, Mark. We wanted to begin by sharing a few details about how ERA fulfills its vision, mandate, and strategic priorities. I'm sure we can all agree 2020 has been a very unsettling year, and what the future holds is even less clear. At ERA, we believe innovation will be the engine of growth for the next normal. While there's been a lot of talk lately about building back better, the fact is Alberta has been building better for years, and ERA's vision is to continue on that path. For more than a decade, ERA's investments have provided a clear line of sight from the carbon price paid by large file emitters to the solutions needed to achieve continued economic and environmental success for Alberta. In Alberta, we remain committed to using public dollars to leverage the investments required to identify and scale up innovation that will ensure we succeed in a lower emissions world. To date, ERA has committed over $600 million to support 183 projects valued at $4.1 billion. These projects cross all sectors and timescales. The large project value reflects our ability to leverage more than 6-to-1 funding from project partners. And we are on track to deliver cumulative GHG reductions of nearly 35 million tons by 2030. These investments will also lead to almost 22,000 jobs being created by 2024 and contribute over $3 billion to Alberta's GDP. And this important work is going to continue. As Mark mentioned, just 2 weeks ago, Minister Jason Nixon announced $750 million from the TIER Fund to lower emissions and get Albertans back to work. Included in this announcement was the news that ERA is investing nearly $10 million to support several carbon capture, utilization, and storage projects aimed at reducing emissions. Our support of the Act 3 initiative highlights how we are reaching beyond Alberta's borders to attract ideas and investment. Through this initiative, Alberta has joined a global collective effort to accelerate technologies that cost-effectively capture and utilize CO2. ERA's $5 million contribution to this $50 million competition will help to identify CCUS technologies with a strong potential for commercialization in Alberta. It will allow us to attract new world-class innovators to Alberta and support Alberta innovators to access international markets. And Mark is going to share more details shortly. Before I hand things over, I want to point out that ERA has two ways to fund projects: through targeted challenges, which involve a rigorous two-stage competitive process. And you can see on this slide some examples, including our BEST challenge, focused on biotechnology, electricity, and sustainable transportation, our natural gas innovation challenge, and our recently started food, farming, and forestry challenge. Potential focus areas for future calls for proposals are outlined in our business plan, which you can find on our website. We also have our partnership intake program. This approach allows us to work closely with our trusted partners to leverage funds and due diligence, share risk, and reduce the administrative burden for applicants. Partnerships help us deliver a unified approach across the innovation ecosystem. A recent example, ERA signed a trusted partner agreement with the X Prize Foundation. Through this partnership, 2 of the 10 finalists in the $20 million NRG COSIA Carbon X Prize, Carbon Corp and Carbon Upcycling Technologies, received $4.5 million in funding from ERA. The Act 3 initiative, as Mark will explain, is a bit of a hybrid of these approaches. It's a competitive call based on a theme, in this case CCUS, but it also taps into a larger opportunity to leverage funds with other funding organizations. If I can leave you with one key message here, we need a global collective effort to accelerate technologies that cost effectively capture CO2. Partnerships and investments like these, Act 3 and X Prize, are critical to helping Alberta leverage its own investments in CCUS, like the Shell Quest project, the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line, and the Alberta Carbon Conversion Technology Center. These efforts help us to increase the value of our natural resources, decarbonize energy, and turn waste into valuable products. With that, I'm going to hand the mic back to Mark, who will get into the details of our latest funding opportunity.
Yeah, thanks very much, Steve. I'm really excited that ERA is participating in this global initiative. CCUS is an area that lends itself well to international collaboration. Ideas and innovation in CCUS are often highly transferable across regions and national borders. So what is ACT? It's an international collaboration among funding organizations with a goal of accelerating CCUS technology toward commercialization. The ACT Consortium is made up of 16 funding organizations from around the world, mostly national, with a couple regional funders, including Alberta. In total, 18 different countries are represented, including the USA, the United Kingdom, Norway, Germany, India, and several others. Alberta is the first subnational participant since joining ACT in late 2019, and we're very happy to be participating in Act 3. Act 3 is the third call for proposals launched by the ACT Consortium, and the first with Alberta as a participant. It's a funding competition with participation from 15 of the 16 ACT Consortium partners and is open to opportunities across the CCUS value chain, including capture, conversion and utilization, as well as sequestration of carbon dioxide. ERA is interested in all 3 of these areas, but I should note that some of the other ACT partners may be primarily focused on particular parts of the CCUS value chain. The total funding commitment across all the ACT partners is approximately $50 million Canadian. Each partner's contribution is in its own currency or else in euros, so there may be some fluctuation with exchange rates. Since this call is targeting collaborative opportunities, each project must be submitted by a consortium of partners. And it's important to note also that each individual funder has its own rules and requirements. These requirements are highlighted in the call text document, but you should encourage your partners to ensure that they're familiar with the requirements in their own region. Now, there are some specific eligibility considerations for each consortium. In order to be eligible, a consortium must consist of at least 3 co-applicants from 3 participating ACT countries or regions, with no maximum. It can be as many as there are partners available in the ACT consortium. One of these co-applicants will need to take on the role of lead applicant, who will be the primary contact with the ACT consortium and will ultimately be responsible for coordinating and managing the project. And the way the funding toward individual partners works is that each co-applicant is funded by the funding partner from their country or region. So a researcher based in Greece, for example, would be funded by the Greek General Secretariat for Research and Technology. Organizations in Alberta would be funded by ERA, and I'll talk more about that in a couple slides. Now, I know there's just under 6 weeks until the submission deadline, but I do want to highlight that there is a matchmaking page available on the ACT Consortium's website. It's a self-serve matchmaking service with a list of organizations that have expressed a willingness to be contacted about potential partnerships. Now, when I checked it last night, there are still no Alberta-based organizations on the list, so I encourage you to sign up or even just to go there, take a look at who's listed on the site already and reach out for potential contacts. It's important to note that in addition to leveraging international funding, these partnerships represent a tremendous opportunity for knowledge sharing and cross-pollination of ideas across the CCUS space. The ACT Consortium sets up annual knowledge sharing workshops. They used to be held in person, and I'm confident they'll go back to that in due course. All ACT funded projects are requested to participate in these events and other events where knowledge is shared and new contacts can be made. Projects funded through the ACT 3 call will have the opportunity to share knowledge through publications, workshops, seminars, and even other means. So the question I'm sure many people here are wondering, and the question I've received most commonly so far is, what exactly can ERA fund through Act 3? So I've tried to distill it down fairly simplistically on this slide here, and there are essentially 2 buckets of activity that ERA will support through Act 3. The first is really the pure ACT consortium model, where USA funds the US-based organization, for example, and ERA funds the Alberta-based organization in a partnership. And that's regardless of where the project is being led or where the bulk of project activity is happening. For example, if an Alberta-based organization is participating in a field pilot that's happening in Norway, ERA can fund the work done by that Alberta-based organization. The second bucket is essentially the traditional ERA funding model, and that is that we can fund projects where the work is happening in Alberta, regardless of where the organization is based. For example, if a technology developer out of British Columbia or Ontario or Alberta for that matter wants to pilot their technology at the ACCTC facility in Alberta, for example, or at an industrial site in Alberta, we can fund that organization even if the applicant is not based in Alberta. So we've got a fair bit of flexibility to make some really exciting things happen through this call. Now, it's really important to note, though, that in either situation here, we are looking for innovation that is well suited to commercialization in Alberta, and applicants through the process will need to demonstrate that suitability. So diving a little deeper into who and what ERA will fund, Steve already mentioned that ERA is contributing $5 million to Act 3. There's no minimum funding request amount, and the maximum is $5 million. For the applicants funded by ERA, we will match eligible project expenses on a one-to-one basis with non-government funds. Our funding can go toward a wide variety of applicant types, including research organizations, universities, industry, SMEs, technology developers, and many others. And in this call, we're open to technology development that's a little earlier stage than our typical funding calls. Nevertheless, as you can see on the screen here, we're primarily interested in supporting technology at the stages of scale up, field testing, field pilots, or advancements at existing field pilots or demonstration projects, or even R&D at existing commercial installations like the ShellQuest project. As with all ERA and ACT evaluations, proposals will be evaluated using a two-stage process. The first stage consists of pre-proposal submissions. These are very similar to what we typically refer to as expressions of interest. After all the applications have been submitted, they are then evaluated by a team of independent experts. And this same thing is done by each of the funding bodies for each of the relevant participants. And if all the funding partners end up being in favor of a proposal, or if enough of them are in favor of a proposal, the projects will be invited to submit a full proposal. This full proposal will include more detail about the proposed project, the expected outcomes, and the plan for implementation of the project. These full proposals will again be evaluated and ranked by a team of independent experts, and a final funding decision will be made by each of the relevant funding bodies as well as by the ACT Consortium. In both stages, projects will be evaluated based on three primary criteria, which are effectively the same as ERA's normal funding criteria. The first one is excellence, which looks at the fit within the scope of the call, the credibility of the technology, the scientific merit, the potential for innovation, also the interregional cooperation, and the relevance of the overall objectives of the project that is being proposed. The second one is impact, which looks at the expected contribution to advancement of CCUS technology. It looks at the impact on environmental, social, and corporate governance aspects. It looks at, of course, greenhouse gas emission reduction potential and industrial relevance. And then the third one is quality, which looks at the overall project implementation plan, including the budget, the work plan, the risk management procedures, and the capability of the proposed team. The deadline for pre-proposals is November 10th, 2020. Now, this is really important. The deadline is at 1 p.m. Central European Time, which, by the way, is 5 a.m. Mountain Time. So what I would encourage everyone is please just treat the deadline as November 9th and forget about the possibility of submitting last minute. That's my advice to you. Projects that are shortlisted in the EOI phase will be notified by December of this year and will have until March of next year to provide their full proposal submissions. Submission of full proposals, I should note, is by invitation only and open only to projects that submitted a pre-proposal and were shortlisted in the process. Of course, as is always the case with ERA and with the ACT process, late submissions will not be accepted. Projects then, at the end of the process, should plan to start their project by September 2021 with a funding duration of up to 3 years. So just before we move to the Q&A session, I want to leave everyone with a couple thoughts on how to prepare a successful submission. The first is simply a reminder that all submissions need to use the ACT templates that are provided. I know it can be very tempting to free-form it or to use your own document that you like much better, but you must use the templates that are provided. On the ACT website and also on the ACT page of our website, you will see a template for stage 1 that can be downloaded as a PDF or as a Microsoft Word file. You'll also see a link for the budget template, which you can download as an Excel file. The lead applicant in the end must submit one and only one application per project on behalf of the entire consortium and all the project partners. The proposal should be submitted with signed letters of intent from all co-applicants and partners as an appendix to the proposal. The page limits need to be followed. Please do not be tempted to go in and change the font size or the margins in the template. And also try to avoid repetition. If you feel that the template is asking for information that you've already provided elsewhere, you're most welcome to cross-reference to avoid this kind of duplication. Again, proposals submitted after the deadline will not be accepted. And then, as a reminder, all proposals must be submitted to the Research Council of Norway, not directly to ERA. All proposals need to be submitted through the Research Council of Norway, who is administering the ACT3 program on behalf of the entire ACT consortium. And of course, my apologies for repeating myself, but again, the submission deadline is at 5 a.m. Mountain Time on November 10. And again, if anyone is planning to submit from Alberta or really just about anywhere in Canada or North America, your best bet is to effectively treat November 9th as the deadline and submit a day early, which is good advice in general in any case. All right, well, if you've made it this far, thank you very much. And this is your opportunity to ask questions of us. So I encourage you, please type your questions. First of all, go to the control panel in the GoToWebinar and open up the questions pane of the control panel. This is typically on the right-hand side of your screen, and you can open it up and it should pop up into a separate screen. Our esteemed colleague, Michelle Gurney, who is ERA's Director of Communications, will be selecting the questions and reading them out for Steve and me to answer. So please say hello to everyone, Michelle, and feel free to fire away whenever you're ready.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Thanks, Mark and Steve. Mark, the first question I have for you here is a direct one, just about a specific project type. And it is, in this call, is a project that involves a hybrid solar propane solution to displace diesel eligible?
Thanks, Michelle. It's a really good question. So it's very difficult on a webinar to sort of adjudicate the eligibility of any individual project. Having said that, what you mentioned, at least at the surface, doesn't appear to be a solution for the CCUS value chain. So what we're looking for, and again, I'm repeating myself a little bit, but we're looking for opportunities that involve carbon capture technology, opportunities that involve CO2 conversion or utilization into valuable products. And we're also looking at CO2 sequestration, and this can be sequestration into geological formations or sequestration into carbon-based products. So at the surface, I would say it doesn't sound like a strong fit, but there may be some details that I'm missing in that regard. And you know, the applicant is welcome to follow up with us, but I would encourage everyone to dig into the call text and take a more detailed look at the eligibility.
Thanks, Mark. And I believe you answered this one, but I'm just going to ask you to repeat your answer here. Does each project need to include international partners to be able to qualify?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's worthwhile repeating. So yeah, and there's a very specific requirement as well that in order to be eligible, all projects need to involve a minimum of 3 consortium partners from 3 regions that are participating in the ACT consortium. And so the participating regions are listed on the ACT website. They include Canada, the USA, United Kingdom, Germany, Norway, Greece, India, and a number of others. I won't list them all right now, but please go to the website and check it out. And remember that each consortium needs to have a minimum of 3 partners representing 3 of those different regions.
Thank you, Mark. And this one, I think, just is a clarifying question because I know you covered this content as well, but I'm just going to ask this question directly. If the project is managed by an Alberta group with 2 other eligible EU partners, but the field location is outside the 16 eligible areas, in Saskatchewan, for example, is that still eligible?
Starting to get to some really good questions. I would say that that's probably a good one to take offline and talk about the specific details. So if we go back to the slide where I talked about the 2 types of projects that we could, or the 2 buckets of funding that we can support through this call. The first is Alberta-based organizations that are part of an international consortium, regardless of where the work is happening. And so if in the situation that you're describing, the work is being led by an Alberta-based organization, which you may have mentioned, but I don't see the question in front of me, so I may have missed that. Then yes, there is probably a situation in which that will work. In the second bucket, where we're talking about work happening in Alberta, I would say if the lead applicant or primary applicant is not Alberta based, and nor are the sort of international partners, and the work itself also isn't happening in Alberta, then it would be a very difficult case to make. So I hope I answered the question, but certainly this may be a situation where a one-on-one phone call or a discussion with the applicant would be beneficial.
Thank you, Mark. So this question is about our Trusted Partners program, and it is, we have geological proposals related to green hydrogen production and CCS related to blue hydrogen. Is the ERA Trusted Partner program still in place, and is this the best place to submit these types of proposals?
Sure. Yeah, so I would say the ERA's partnership intake program is still operational. We're still working closely with our trusted partners to look for high quality opportunities that don't fit with any of our current calls for proposals and may otherwise, quote unquote, fall through the cracks because of the timing of our calls for proposals. You know, whether the particular project is a good fit for this call for proposals, for an upcoming future call for proposals that we might be looking at, or for our partnership intake program, is something that we'd be very happy to discuss with whoever's asking the question.
Thanks, Mark. The next question that's framed up here is, who's a more favorable type of applicant? Is it an industrial partner as the lead, or would it be a technology provider as the lead? For example, a university lab. Is there a preference?
Yeah, it's Steve here. I would say there's not a preference. It's really the technology, the potential, and those criteria that Mark laid out earlier are the key factors. We'd welcome either the lead being an industrial partner or a research partner. If there's a customer and an application there, that's what we really care about, as opposed to the nature of the organization making the submission.
Maybe if it's all right, I might add very briefly to that and say that sometimes having, whether it's a lead partner or someone providing a support letter, there can be some benefit to having an industry, some sort of industry representation from the perspective of providing demonstration of a market opportunity and a market demand for what's being looked at. But as Steve said, there's really no preference in terms of who the lead applicant is. And what I would encourage any consortium to do, or any set of partners to do, is look internally and discuss amongst the partners what makes the most sense from a contractual perspective, from a project management perspective, as to who the lead applicant would be.
Thanks, Mark. Is there a limit to the number of companies that can join together as co-applicants?
No, there is no limit. I don't have a good number, but I'm aware that in the Act 1 and Act 2 calls for proposals, there were some projects that were funded with quite a large number of partners and participants. I'm not going to give you a number because I don't remember exactly off the top of my head, but certainly there's no limit. You know, the only thing I would mention is that at some point it's worthwhile thinking about the role of the lead applicant and the responsibility to manage the project and be responsible for management of the consortium and coordination with all of the partners. So there can be some increase in complexity, I should say, as you increase the number of partners, but strictly speaking, there's no limit.
Thanks, Mark. Just to follow on to that is, can a co-partner or partner be involved in more than one project, especially if there's technical or testing facilities involved?
Yes, absolutely.
Great, thank you. And I know you were saying for specific details, it's better to have some one-on-one conversations, but this question is, would engineering feed and process modeling funding qualify for this call?
So I would say that it may be worthwhile having a one-on-one conversation to talk about the specifics rather than give a definitive answer, but it depends on the value proposition of the project. Generally speaking, I would say from an eligibility perspective, yes, we are open to consideration of either of those types of projects, but ultimately the value proposition of the project and then the line of sight to where it will go will be ultimately an important factor in the evaluation of these proposals.
Mark, is it okay to have two collaborators from the US?
Absolutely, yeah, that would be great.
Okay, now I'm actually going to jump up to one of the questions that came in just as you were beginning the webinar today. And it was about the ShellQuest technology, which was successfully implemented in 2015. The question was, why pursue new CCS technology that is unlikely to be scalable? Why not proceed with the proven ShellQuest technology?
Yeah, I think we'd answer that is we need to explore a bunch of options. The person asking the question is absolutely right. We need to advance those proven technologies, but this is also about where those great ideas that may actually advance in terms of the economics or the ability to deploy in some way beyond what Quest has done. So it is sure it can be doing the same thing better, but we're also looking for those better ways of doing things.
Thank you, Steve. So I've got a question here that's related to the signing of agreements, and it looks like it's about consortia agreements. And Mark, you recommended that people need to start as early as possible. Is an agreement amongst consortia required before the proposal is submitted?
No, it is not required before the proposal is submitted. Ultimately, it will be a requirement before we enter into contractual agreements with the individual co-applicants and the lead applicant for that matter, but it is not required to be finalized before the submission deadline.
Thanks, Mark. I'm just looking for the next question here. Can the co-applicants all be from Alberta?
So there can be multiple co-applicants from Alberta, but in order to be eligible for the Act 3 call, there would need to be additional co-applicants from a minimum of 2 other participating regions, such as the US or Norway or whatever the case might be.
Thank you, Mark. Can you just talk about what's the TRL range of eligible projects here?
Yeah, you know, in some ways we sort of deliberately avoided the use of specific TRL numbers for a number of reasons. One, because there's a lot of gray area, and you know, I hate to say it, but in some cases, subjectivity around TRL numbers. There's also some variation amongst the participating regions and participants in the ACT consortium of where the optimum TRL focus is. So I would encourage everyone to look at some of the individual requirements of different funders in the ACT consortium. From ERA's perspective, or Alberta's perspective in this participation, ERA's typical funding range from a TRL perspective is somewhere on the order of starting at TRL 6 or 7 up to basically TRL 9. I would say in this call, you know, for a number of reasons. One, because of the nature of the collaboration, also because of the quantity of dollars available. We want to be open to TRLs that are a little bit lower. I think it's fair to say that we're not reaching all the way back to kind of TRL 1, 2, 3 scientific discovery, applied R&D, but we want to stick to opportunities where technologies have been proven in concept, if that's an applicable phrase, for what we're looking at. And we want to scale things up and move them into the field for some sort of field component, field testing, or whatever the case is. So if I had to put a number on it, I'd say, you know, at the very earliest, we're looking at TRL maybe 5-ish, potentially 4, but certainly in that 5 to 8 range is the sweet spot for this particular call.
Thank you, Mark. I just wonder, can you elaborate on the definition for an Alberta-based company? Is it headquartered here, operational here?
Yeah, I'd say both of those. And you know, if there are some questions around what exactly that means, we're happy to have a one-on-one conversation. But we're looking at Alberta-based organizations, Alberta-based teams that are here. Don't necessarily need to be headquartered in Alberta. If they're part of a large international organization, but they have a team here or an operational division here in Alberta that's participating in the project, that will be quite sufficient.
Mark, the next question is a bigger question about ACT funding overall, and it's about the one-to-one funding model. This individual sees this as a challenge for most technology and innovation research projects, and they're wondering if this is a common model for a call like this and for other ACT partnerships.
Yeah, the requirements around fund matching or maximum percentage of funds applied does vary across the different consortium partners, and you know, I think some of those details are laid out in the call text, and to the extent that they're not, I know that each of the participating partners in the ACT consortium is happy to have those conversations with potential applicants. So there is some variation. The one-to-one matching is a rule and a feature that ERA uses for all of our calls for proposals to ensure that there's a demonstration of market opportunity, market demand from the private sector or from other non-government sources of funding. We understand that certainly it can be a challenge for some particular projects, and we're happy to talk about what different sources of funding can be represented, because there is some flexibility. We typically say private dollars. There is some flexibility. It doesn't, strictly speaking, need to be equity investment or anything narrow like that. But it is a requirement for ERA's funding that we apply to all of our calls for proposals.
Thank you, Mark. The next question is a project that offers CO2 avoidance eligible rather than dealing with generated CO2?
That's a great question. And again, it may be worthwhile having a one-on-one conversation about this. I'm not envisioning, again, at the surface what exactly that would look like and fit within the capture, conversion, utilization, or sequestration of CO2 space, but I could be totally wrong about that. So on the surface, it sounds like it's probably not a strong fit for this particular call. Now, I would say ERA and a larger perspective is very interested in greenhouse gas emission reductions, broadly speaking, with a fairly liberal definition of CO2 reduction and CO2 avoidance. But in this particular call, it sounds like a project of that nature might not be a fit. But as I said, I could be wrong, and it may be worthwhile having a conversation about that.
Thanks, Mark. I wonder if you can explain the rationale behind having 3 consortium partners from different areas when the funding's coming from Alberta.
Yeah, this is okay. So I can mention a couple things about that. One is that ERA provides funding through our partnership program, through our calls for proposals for a number of different opportunities. And this partnership requirement, consortium requirement from different regions is not something that we generally require. In fact, this is sort of a first of kind foray for us into this international collaboration space. So it is not a rule across the board for ERA. It is a rule specific to this particular funding competition that is really trying to seek out the opportunities that would benefit from international collaboration. And Steve and I both touched on this a little bit in our speaking points throughout the presentation, that CCUS is an area that more than just about any other area in greenhouse gas mitigation opportunities, where there's a high degree of transferability of technology and knowledge and information cross-regionally and across national borders. And so from that perspective, this entire consortium and this entire call for proposals is predicated on the notion of international and cross-regional collaboration, which is why embedded in the call for proposals a requirement for collaboration. So if you've got opportunities, really high quality opportunities that don't lend themselves well to collaboration or international participation, we want to hear about those as well. And there may be either existing or future funding mechanisms within ERA to take a look at those opportunities. But for this particular call, we want to find the opportunities that benefit from that international collaboration, international knowledge sharing. It goes sort of both ways, in the sense of looking at projects that happen here, where the knowledge from those projects and those technology advancement opportunities can be taken back to other regions that are participating in the ACT Consortium and can be benefited internationally, as well as the other way, where Alberta-based organizations can work on R&D and pilot projects that's happening elsewhere, and bring that knowledge back and the technology information back for proliferation in the province of Alberta.
Yeah, and Michelle, I just want to jump in on this because I think this is such an important point for everyone listening, that this really is a new effort for ERA to reach out to the world. And it really is about bringing the world to Alberta and Alberta to the world. You know, I suspect some of the listeners say, geez, this is pretty complicated. The reality of these international relationships and partnerships is that there is a level of complexity that we don't normally see, but we do think there's huge value in this. And just to reinforce Mark's point, this isn't our only funding stream. We'll continue to do our challenges, our partnership intakes, and other program designs. So this isn't sort of the one-off only direction we're going to do. This is just another tool in our toolbox, because part of the challenge that we found over the years is people around the world don't see the importance and the effort that's gone on in Alberta in this space. And so when we got involved in this, it was a chance to tell our story. And when we told our story, the world said, holy cow, you guys are doing amazing things. You can help the world solve the problems they're trying to solve. So again, this is a unique approach we're taking. There is some complexity that is new to us, as it is to many of you listening, but we see huge value. But this isn't the only door that ERA has open.
Thanks, Steve. There's several questions here just about the criteria for the one-to-one, like questions on whether in kind would qualify. If somebody doesn't have that cash, are there other things that would qualify? I wonder if either of you could speak to that.
I can start, and Steve, of course, is most welcome to jump in as well. The quick answer, I would say, is that we have a cost eligibility guidelines document available on our website that I encourage everyone to check out. I would say somewhat similar to TRL, the definitions of cash contributions and in-kind contributions can vary across funding organizations. And so from ERA's perspective, there are some what you would traditionally refer to as in-kind contributions that we consider eligible. And I welcome everyone to look at our cost eligibility guidelines for further information. And similarly, again, we're happy to have the conversation about what we can consider as an eligible contribution. We want to be reasonable with that. We at the same time, we want to support incremental go forward costs to demonstrate as I talked about the demand and the opportunity for the private sector or other investors to make a demonstration that this is something that the market is demanding.
Yeah, and just to be clear, this is a very competitive process. And if you can't demonstrate that there's others that think it has value and is worth investing in, it's really hard to get to the top of the queue. So think of it as a gate that you need to walk through so you can demonstrate that there's somebody else out there that says, yeah, we're prepared to share the risk and invest in this because of the potential. And, we will always, if good ideas come up and there's a difficulty in making the one-to-one, we'll always look at that. But just think of the review team. If you say no one else is prepared to support this project, how are you going to get to the top of the list?
Thanks, Mark and Steve. So the next question is, would Alberta and Saskatchewan institutions be treated as partners from two regions?
Yeah, that's another good question. So we would welcome applications with partners from Alberta and Saskatchewan or other provinces and territories within Canada for that matter. As it pertains to the consortium requirement, Alberta is participating as a subnational region in the Act 3. My understanding is that Saskatchewan is not a participant in the ACT consortium, although that would be fantastic. And so to meet the requirement of having 3 participants from 3 participating regions, a partner based in another province within Canada would not count, so to speak, toward that international collaboration piece, or interregional collaboration, I should say.
Thanks, Mark. This is just a real specific question about, we've talked a lot about the different regions and partnerships, and there is a question here about, is there actually a region map? It sounds like somebody's looked and can't see that on the ACT website. Do you know of a resource like that exists, Mark, and where somebody might find it?
Yes, there is a region map. It may not be on the website itself, although I could be wrong about that. I don't have the specific location off the top of my mind, but there's also a great webinar on the ACT website that was put out by the Research Council of Norway for all interested participants internationally. And in that webinar, I can't remember which slide, something like the third or the fourth slide in there, there is a map of the participating regions. There's also, if you look in the call text document, there's not a map per se, but midway through that document, there is a list of all of the participating regions, as well as the individual, oh, pardon me, the individual monetary contribution from the participating funder from those regions.
Thanks, Mark. This is a question about the funding specifically. If the project has already started, are those costs incurred valid or are those not refundable?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. And I would say this is, I may have mentioned it, and my apologies if it's not on the slide, but this is in alignment with what ERA typically requires, and that is that we can contribute toward costs that are incurred after the date of funding approval. So any costs that are incurred between now and the funding approval, that's fine, and it's great. We don't require you to wait until our funding is approved to get going on activity. We want you to be able to keep the momentum going for the project, to set yourselves up for success. But we, strictly speaking, cannot contribute toward any costs that are incurred before the date of funding approval.
Thank you, Mark. So Mark and Steve, there's quite a few questions on here that are about like specific project related questions, and people are wondering who they should follow up with after this call to explore those further.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I would say there's a couple things to mention. So if you go to the ACT3 website, there is a list of contacts for each of the individual funding organizations represented. My name is listed as the contact point for Alberta's participation. I'm very happy to have conversations. Depending on the number of inquiries that we get, it can sometimes take a little bit of time to arrange a one-on-one conversation. And so we've also got an applications inbox using the email address applications@eralberta.ca. That's it's technically speaking, what we call a shared mailbox that has access to a handful of folks on ERA's technical team. And so if you email that email address, there are a number of us that regularly check that inbox, and we'll be happy to set up a one-on-one conversation with you. It might be myself, it might be one of my colleagues, but certainly we're all equipped to talk about ERA's participation.
Thank you, Mark. This is a really good question as well. If you have the technical partners aligned and signed already, and the funding industrial partners are still in discussion, should they file or are they disqualified for a call like this?
Yeah, no, I apologize. I'm not sure I fully understand the question. If I've got it correctly, it sounds like there's been a lot of progress made in terms of the project implementation team, the technical partners, so to speak, but there's still a little bit of work to be done in terms of industrial partners, and whether that's from a funding perspective or from sort of a site host perspective or perhaps a feedstock perspective. If I've got the question right, then I would say, yes, I encourage you to apply, particularly at the pre-proposal stage. At this stage, there's more emphasis placed on the quality of the idea and the quality of the innovation and the potential outcomes. And the deadline for submission is November 10th, and then ultimately the deadline for submission of the full proposals is March of next year, and then the decisions will be made in the summer of next year, and applicants will be notified. So there's a little bit of time to cross some of the T's and dot some of the I's in that regard. So I would encourage folks to apply. I will say that there is benefit in demonstrating some progress down the path of securing all of the partners, and whether that's from a funding perspective, from a site host perspective, or otherwise, but it's not a requirement or a disqualification factor if you don't have all of those things lined up by the date of submission.
Thanks, Mark. And I know we've only got a few minutes left, and there's a really good question here about the funding amount. And it's about really framing up CCUS or CCS is such a big opportunity for Alberta's future economy. Why would ERA only put $5 million toward this technology development?
Yeah, this isn't our only investment. Again, this is one opportunity to bring together international partners, to share ideas, to share wisdom, and to advance the technology at an international scale. ERA has made significant investments in this space in the past, beyond this 5 million, and we intend to make additional investments in this space moving forward too. So think of this as just another opportunity. It's an opportunity to leverage international resources, but Alberta and ERA in particular will be making additional investments in this space.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And I would say just as a follow-up to some of the points that both Steve and I have made, if there are other opportunities to advance important projects in the CCUS space, whether or not we have an immediate funding opportunity, we always like to hear about those, and we're open to exploring whether there's a pathway to find funding, whether it's from ERA, from one of our trusted partners, potentially through our partnership intake program, or otherwise. We want to try and help to find a way to accelerate those technologies, even if it's beyond the dollar amounts available in this particular funding call.
Thank you both. I think we've got time for one or two more questions. This is back to the consortium itself and how it works, Mark. So do the participating regions review the projects together and decide who gets the funding? Or is it possible that one region might choose to fund while the other region decides not to fund?
Yeah, I would say that's a possibility. Having not participated in Act 1 or Act 2, I can't say firsthand how common that situation is. And I would, to answer the first part of the question, I would say the answer is both. Each participating region and organization needs to ensure its decision makers that the funding for a particular project is well aligned with the mandate and with the funding requirements. So we conduct an individual evaluation of the projects, but we also look at it in partnership with the entire ACT consortium. And that conversation becomes much more involved at the full proposal stage when we're ultimately making a final funding decision. I would say in addition to that, if we get to a situation where there are multiple partners that are in favor of funding a particular project, but there may be one partner, for example, that simply can't justify participation for whatever reason, I think we can cross that bridge when we get there and see if there's still a possibility to move the project ahead, even if one of the particular partners isn't able to participate or is able to perhaps find funding from a different source.
Thanks, Mark. So I think, Mark, it's time that we've got to wrap up. And I wonder, because there are a few questions about this again, if you can just remind people where they can send their specific questions, and then I'll go into the questions and I'll provide everybody with the email addresses once again.
Yeah, thanks very much, Michelle. It was a very rich set of questions, and I'm happy to see that there's interest and that there were so many questions that came in. As you said, we're at 11 o'clock Mountain Time here, and that brings us to the end of the webinar. And I certainly want to thank everybody very much for interest and for participation today. As Michelle mentioned, there are probably some unanswered questions after the webinar, and there may be some unanswered questions after reviewing the supporting materials. So the first thing I would encourage everyone to do is to check out the call text document available, and that I believe is posted on our website as well as on the ACT International website. And if there are some unanswered questions after reviewing those supporting materials, after looking at our cost eligibility guidelines document, you're most welcome to email us and reach out to us. The email address to use is applications@eralberta.ca. So thanks once again. We hope to have the webinar posted on our website by the end of this week or by early next week. I want to thank everybody once again and wish everybody a wonderful day.